My remarks this evening, which will be a rebuttal to the remarks famously made by Governor Cuomo 25 years ago, are of the sort that used to cause my daughter when she was young, and I dare say still probably causes her today, she's a senior at Princeton, a good deal of puzzlement. I suppose from time to time she would hear me talking with my wife, and she was old enough to figure a few things out. And on one occasion, she said to me, "Daddy, you mean you gave a speech that you knew would make people mad? They won't clap if you do that." Now, that was kind of interesting because she had in her mind the idea that the purpose of the speech is to draw applause, which, is pretty smart, right? I mean, it's not quite right, but pretty smart of a little kid to come up with that idea. But I'm afraid it is the kind of thing that, to say the least, not everyone will agree with. And of course, I should begin by recognizing that this is an issue on which reasonable people of goodwill can and do disagree. I want to engage Governor Cuomo in the spirit, as Corey pointed out, in which he engaged his audience, one that invites discourse, discussion, tries to elevate the quality of the discussion. When you touch on an issue as sensitive as abortion, related issues, there are nerves there. There are raw nerves. And often, as we know from our experience in this country over the past 40 years and more, sometimes discussions of this sort generate nothing but heat. Well, Governor Cuomo wanted to generate some light, and I want to generate some light as well. We come out at opposite places on the issue, and I want to say why I come out as I do and offer some criticisms of the reasons that he adduced for his position. I'll be speaking mainly of Cuomo, but the position that Cuomo adopts is, of course, widely held, really by people in both parties and by people across the political spectrum. I'll also speak mainly this evening of the position of the Catholic Church, although, again, that same position is one that is held by people of a wide range of other faiths and by some people of no particular faith. But Cuomo was and is a Catholic. I myself am a Catholic. He framed his discussion in terms of an engagement with Catholic teaching, and so I'm going to do the same. But I hope and trust, just as I'm sure he did, that what I say will be relevant to people who are not Catholics. I should also say that my remarks are mainly directed at a particular position with which Cuomo was associated, and that is the position that says, I myself believe that abortion is wrong, but though I am personally opposed to it, I think that women have a right to have abortions, and therefore the law ought not to impede their freedom of choice to have abortions. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening. I'm not going to be talking about very much about a different issue, and that is the position of someone who says, look, abortion should be lawful, women shouldn't be impeded from having abortions, it should be widely available to women who need it, because there's really nothing wrong with it. It's the solution, a legitimate solution, perhaps a tragic one, but a legitimate solution to a problem. But again, that wasn't Cuomo's position. The position that Cuomo did adopt has become widely accepted among certain Catholics and others who regard themselves as pro-life, and so I want to engage that. Well, let me begin by describing the Catholic Church's position, and I do this, again, having in mind that it is not uniquely the position of the Catholic Church. Many other Christian denominations, as well as some non-Christian faiths, hold the same thing, although there are other religions who hold something different. The Catholic Church proclaims the principle that every human being, without regard to race or sex or ethnicity, and equally, though, without regard to to age or size or stage of development or condition of dependency, is entitled to the full protection of the laws. That's the basic premise of Catholic teaching in all issues having to do with life and death, whether it's euthanasia, abortion, what have you. The Church teaches that human beings at every stage of development, including those at the embryonic and fetal stages, and those in every condition, including those who are mentally retarded, even severely mentally retarded or physically disabled, and those who are suffering from severe dementias or other mind-impairing or memory-impairing afflictions, possess fundamental human rights. Above all, each of us possesses the right to life. Now, of course, this teaching is disputed by some, by many. There are those, including some Catholics, who deny that human embryos and fetuses are, in fact, human beings. They assert that the human embryo or fetus is merely a potential human life, not a nascent human life. Now, the trouble with this position, as I see it, is not theological, but rather scientific. It flies in the face of the established facts of human embryology and developmental biology. A human embryo or fetus is not something distinct or different in kind from a human being, the way that a rock or a potato or an alligator is something different in kind from a human being, a different kind of thing than a human being. A human embryo or fetus, rather, just is a human being, a developing human being, at a particular early stage of development. Terms like embryo, fetus, infant, adolescent, adult don't refer to different kinds of entities or beings, but to the same kind of entity or being, indeed to the same being at different developmental stages. A human embryo, even prior to implantation, is a whole distinct living member of the species Homo sapiens. The embryonic or fetal human being requires only what any human being at any stage of development requires for his or her survival, namely adequate nutrition and an environment sufficiently hospitable to sustain life. Ordinarily, of course, that is the environment of the mother's womb, although in principle, and perhaps in the not-too-distant future in practice, it could be artificially provided. From the beginning, each human being, this is as true of me as it is of you and any other member of the human family, possesses actually and not merely potentially the genetic constitution and the active disposition, the epigenetic state, for self-directed development, not extrinsically directed development, not signaling from the mother, self-directed development, internally directed development, from the embryonic and through the fetal, infant, child, and adolescent stages, and into adulthood with his or her distinctness, unity, determinateness, and identity fully intact. In this crucial respect, crucial for the moral argument, the embryo is quite unlike the gametes, that is, the sperm and egg, whose union, when successful, brings a new human being into existence. You and I were never sperm cells. Neither you nor I was ever an ovum. Those were genetically and functionally parts of other human beings, our parents. But each of us was, and here's the crucial distinction, once an embryo, just as each of us was once an adolescent and before that a child, an infant, a fetus. Of course, in the embryonic, fetal, and infant stages, we were highly vulnerable and dependent creatures, but we were nevertheless complete, distinct human beings. Each of us began as a single-cell embryo, the zygote, and through an internally directed process by which we integrate our own organic functioning, develop from the embryonic into and through the fetal, infant, child, and adolescent stages, and into adulthood. As the leading textbooks in human embryology and developmental biology unanimously attest, we were not mere clumps of cells like moles or tumors. So the basic rights people possess simply by virtue of their humanity, assuming that there are such things as human rights, rights that people possess simply by virtue of their humanity, rights that you have by virtue of being a human being, including above all the right to life, we possessed at every stage of our development. We possess them by virtue of coming into being as a human being. They're not something we acquire later. This is what it means to say that human rights are inherent. They're not achievements. They're something that we have by virtue of the kind of being we are, a human being, a being possessing a certain kind of nature, a rational nature, even though in some cases we're impeded, for example, in severe retardation. In some cases, human beings are impeded from the full expression of that rationality. We would still, if we found a way to cure those who are suffering from those retardations, we wouldn't be changing them from one kind of entity into another kind. We would be perfecting them with the nature they in fact have. Now, another school of thought concedes that human embryos are human beings. I think this is a much more credible school of thought, one that provides a much stronger defense of legal abortion and embryo-destructive research. This school of thought concedes that human embryos are human beings. However, it denies that all human beings are persons. So it draws a distinction between human beings and persons. Some are, some aren't. There are, according to this school of thought, pre-personal human beings, that is, human beings who are not yet persons, and post-personal human beings, that is, human beings who are no longer persons. They once were, but are no longer. They're still human beings. They still have that biological status, according to this view, but they've lost the attributes that make them persons. And of course, there would also be, according to this view, some human beings, the severely retarded, who are not now, never will be, and never were persons. They are simply human non-persons. They're human beings, that's a biological category, but they lack the attributes of personhood. Proponents of this view insist that human beings in the embryonic and fetal stages are not yet persons, and that becomes the foundation for the justification for killing them. People who take this view don't shrink from acknowledging that what we're doing is killing a human being in those cases. But they say that it's not wrong because it's not killing a person. It's killing a human being who is not yet a person. The way euthanasia would not be wrong on this view because it's killing a human being, sure, but one who is no longer a person. So human beings who are not persons, according to this view, do not possess a right to life. Hence the willingness of my Princeton colleague Peter Singer, for example, or University of Colorado Professor Michael Tooley, and others to countenance infanticide as well as abortion. Why do they countenance infanticide? Because they say if we distinguish human being from person so that it's not enough simply to be a human being to be a person. Some human beings aren't persons because they lack certain attributes. What are the attributes? Well, according to those who take this view, it's got to be the active ability to engage in some characteristically human mental functions, to carry out some kind of self-awareness or self-consciousness or thought or deliberation. And it takes them to infanticide for the obvious reason that there's nothing about birth that confers that quality or those qualities or attributes. Infants don't become really self-aware in a way that someone like Singer or Tooley would regard as qualifying them for personhood until, at a minimum, several months after birth, and perhaps even longer. At one point, Professor Singer proposed that the legal standard should be 28 days after birth. Parents should have 28 days to decide whether they want the baby or not. They have 28 days in which they can kill the baby if they regard the baby as not wanted. And he said in making that argument that it's not that I think they actually become persons at 28 days, but we know that that early on in their lives they're still not persons, and it would be safe, very safe as a precaution, to hold the possibility of killing to 28 days and not go further. Although as a matter of fact, the child wouldn't actually become a person, wouldn't have the qualities and attributes of personhood until later. So, for Singer and those who hold his view, only those human beings who have achieved and retained what are regarded as the defining attributes of personhood, whether those are considered to be detectable brain functions, self-awareness, or immediately exercisable capacities for characteristically human mental functions, possess a right to life. Now, the trouble with this position is not scientific. I can't run an argument against this position like the argument I ran against the previous position. I can't just point you to the elementary works of human embryology and developmental biology. These guys agree with me about that stuff. They've looked at these materials. They understand that you've got a human being from the earliest stages of development. So the trouble is not scientific, it's philosophical. In my view, the trouble is that a view like Professor Singer's and Professor Tooley's makes nonsense of our political, philosophical, and for many of us, theological commitment to the principle that all human beings are equal in fundamental worth and dignity, that fundamental principle of equality, which I would argue is at the heart of our political order and indeed our civilizational order, the one that we have struggled throughout the entire history of our civilization to finally live up to, and never live up to fully, but the principle nevertheless to which our great political and religious prophets appeal, the principle to which Martin Luther King, for example, appealed in making his case against the evil of racial segregation and racial injustice. This view that there can be human non-persons, that there are some human beings who just aren't equal because they lack the attributes of personhood, infants, fetuses, mentally retarded people, people suffering from Alzheimer's and other dementias, generates puzzles that simply cannot be resolved, such as the puzzle as to why this or that accidental quality, which most human beings eventually acquire in the course of normal development, but others do not, and which some retain and others lose, and which some have to a greater degree than others, should count as the criterion of personhood. The superior position, it seems to me, is that human beings possess equally an intrinsic dignity that is the moral ground for the right to life of all. This is a right possessed by every human being simply by virtue of his or her humanity. It does not depend on an individual's age or size or stage of development any more than it depends on a person's race or sex or ethnicity, nor can it be erased by an individual's physical or mental infirmity or condition of dependency. It is what makes the life of even a severely retarded child equal in fundamental worth and dignity to the life of a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. It explains why we have always understood, and indeed prided ourselves on the view, that we may not licitly extract transplantable organs even from a severely retarded child, even to save the life of a brilliant physicist who happens to be afflicted, let's say, with a life-threatening liver or kidney or heart ailment, which could be resolved favorably by taking a heart from a retarded child. Sure, we recognize the obvious inequalities between Albert Einstein and a severely retarded person. We recognize that there are many respects in which they are not equal. But to my mind, it's the glory of our civilization that we recognize that in the most fundamental respect of all, that is, in respect of their basic dignity, Albert Einstein is of no greater worth and dignity than a retarded child. We really are committed to the proposition that all men are created equal. We've always prided ourselves when we've lived up to it and felt ashamed of ourselves in the long run when we failed to live up to it. In any event, the position that all human beings equally possess fundamental human rights, including the right to life, is the definitively settled teaching of the Catholic Church. It's the teaching of other churches as well. I'm not claiming any unique position here for Catholicism. But I've got my focus on Catholicism here for the reasons I indicated at the beginning. So it's on this basis that the Church proclaims that the taking of human life in abortion, infanticide, embryo-destructive research, euthanasia, even things like terrorism, or killing non-combatants in wars or killing prisoners, are always and everywhere gravely wrong. And there's more. For the Church also teaches that it is the solemn obligation of legislators and other public officials, as servants of the common good, to honor and protect the rights of all. There is a political teaching to Catholicism, and I think many, if not most, other religions include that much of a political teaching. If you are holding responsibility for the common good, if you've been entrusted with the care of the common good in some dimension, as a legislator or as an executive, or in a more restricted way as a judge or other judicial official, if you hold that, then you have a moral obligation to honor and protect the rights of all. The principle of equality demands, as a matter of strict justice, that protection against lethal violence be extended to every person in the community, everyone within the community's jurisdiction. Those to whom the care of the common good is entrusted, above all those who participate in making the community's laws, have primary responsibility for ensuring that the right to life is embodied in the laws and effectively protected in practice. Now, notice, by the way, and this is very important, that the obligation of the public official is not properly described as enforcing the teachings of the Catholic Church or the Baptist faith or the Jewish faith or what have you. It is rather to fulfill the demands of justice and the common good in light of the principle, which Catholicism is by no means unique in proclaiming, of the inherent and equal dignity of every member of the human family. Yet today, many Catholic politicians are staunch supporters of what they describe as a woman's right to abortion. Most of these politicians also support the creation and government funding of an industry that would produce tens of thousands of human embryos by cloning for use in biomedical research in which these embryonic human beings would be destroyed. You can just look at who's co-sponsoring the so-called therapeutic cloning bills in the Congress. Catholic politicians in the United States and in other nations who support abortion and embryo-destructive research typically claim to be personally opposed to these practices, but respectful of the rights of others who disagree to act on their own judgments of conscience without legal interference. This is the position that New York Governor Mario Cuomo famously articulated and defended in that speech 25 years ago at Notre Dame. And again, notice that it's different from a position that I've not focused on. I'm not going to focus on this evening. The position that says abortion should be lawful and available because there's nothing wrong with it. It might be a tragic choice, but it's not a wrongful choice. It's not Cuomo's position. It's not the position of most Catholic and many other politicians. Their position is, yes, there's something wrong with it. That's why I'm personally opposed to it. I don't want it to happen. I don't want women to avail themselves of it. But nevertheless, I think women have a right to it, and I am therefore pro-choice. Now, more recently, Cuomo spoke on the issue at a forum in Washington, D.C. on politics and faith in America, and he was able to develop his position at greater length. And there he offered an argument in defense of his 1984 speech, which, if successful, not only justifies Catholic politicians in supporting legal abortion and embryo-destructive research, but actually requires them to do so. It requires them to respect the right of people to engage in these practices despite their admitted moral wrongfulness. So Cuomo now has taken a step more bold, an even bolder step. It's not just that it's acceptable for a Catholic politician who understands the morality of the situation properly to support legal abortion and even its public funding while being personally opposed to it. This bolder position is that if you understand the morality correctly, including the Catholic Church's own teaching about religious liberty, if you understand it correctly, then you have an obligation as a Catholic to support legal abortion and its public funding, despite what he continues to say is the wrongfulness of these practices, the grave wrongfulness, serious wrongfulness of these practices. Cuomo asserted that holders of public office, including Catholic office holders, have a responsibility, and let me quote him here now because this is crucial. I don't want to paraphrase him because you might then think I'm distorting his language. Let me just say exactly what he says in his words. Office holders, including Catholics, have a responsibility, quote, to create conditions under which all citizens are reasonably free to act according to their own religious beliefs, even when those acts conflict with Roman Catholic dogma regarding divorce, birth control, abortion, stem cell research, and even the existence of God, unquote. According to Cuomo, Catholics should support legalized abortion and embryo-destructive research, as he himself does, because in guaranteeing these rights to others, they guarantee, he says, their own right, and I quote, to reject abortions and to refuse to participate in or contribute to removing stem cells from embryos. Bless you. But Cuomo's idea, and here's my first counterattack, Cuomo's idea that the right, as he puts it, to reject abortion and embryo-destructive experimentation entails, logically or somehow, a right of others as a matter of religious liberty to engage in these practices is, I submit to you, simply, if spectacularly, fallacious. The fallacy comes into focus immediately if one considers whether the right of a Catholic or Baptist or Jew or member of any other faith to reject infanticide, slavery, the exploitation of labor, any of those evils, entails a right of others who happen not to share these religious convictions to kill, enslave, and exploit. It's by the expedient of classifying pro-life convictions about abortion and embryo-destructive research as, quote, Roman Catholic dogmas, unquote, Cuomo smuggles into his premises, the premises of his argument, the controversial conclusion he's trying to prove. If pro-life principles were indeed merely dogmatic teachings, as he classifies them, such as the teaching that Jesus of Nazareth is the only begotten Son of God, then, according to the Church herself, not to mention American constitutional law and the law of many other republics, would forbid a legislator from using the coercive power of the state to enforce the dogma. The trouble for Cuomo is that pro-life principles, or any other pro-justice principles, are not, at least as Catholics, many members of many other faiths understand them, mere matters of dogma, nor are they understood as such by the Catholic Church, whose beliefs Cuomo claims to affirm, or by pro-life citizens, whether they happen to be Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, Latter-day Saints, Hindus, Buddhists, agnostics, or atheists. And there are pro-life people in all of those categories, just as there are pro-choice people in all of those categories. Rather, pro-life citizens understand these principles and propose them to their fellow citizens in the deliberative process of democratic engagement as fundamental norms of justice and human rights that can be understood and affirmed even apart from claims of revelation and religious authority. It will not do to suggest, as Cuomo seems to suggest, that the sheer fact that the Catholic Church or some other religious body has a teaching against these practices, and that some or even many people reject this teaching, means that laws prohibiting the killing of human beings in the embryonic and fetal stages violate the freedom of religion of those who do not accept the teaching. If this were anything other than a fallacy, then laws against killing infants, as Singer would permit, or owning slaves, as obviously many people thought was perfectly permissible, including many religious people, exploiting workers, and many other grave forms of injustice, really would be violations of religious freedom. They would be impositions on the religious freedom of those who happen to think, perhaps on the basis of their religious faith, that there was nothing wrong with exploiting workers, owning slaves, killing infants. But surely Cuomo would not want to endorse that conclusion. So I think he's got to go back and undo the logical fallacy that he's backed himself into. See, Cuomo provides no reason to distinguish those acts and practices putatively falling within the category of religious freedom, because they're, quote, religious dogmas, from those falling outside it, like doing something against exploitation of labor, or trying to end slavery, or preventing infanticide. So we must ask, if abortion is immunized against legal restriction on the ground that it is a matter of religious belief, how can it be that slavery is not similarly immunized? If today abortion cannot be prohibited without violating the right to religious freedom of people whose religions do not object to abortion, how can Cuomo say that the prohibition of slavery by the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1866 did not violate the right to religious freedom of those in the 19th century whose religions did not condemn slaveholding? Cuomo says that the Catholic Church, and I quote him, understands that our public morality depends on a consensus view of right and wrong, unquote. But that seems to me just straightforwardly wrong. It would be scandalous to argue that Americans should have opposed a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery in the 19th century, or legislation protecting the civil rights of the oppressed descendants of slaves in the mid-20th century, on the ground that prudence or realism or a lack of consensus or disagreement requires respect for moral pluralism because there is no consensus about whether the act in question is right or wrong. At one point in the Forum on Politics and Faith, Governor Cuomo suggested that laws against abortion and embryo-destructive research would force people who do not object to such things to practice the religion of people who do. This is a very, very strong argument about religious freedom. But again, it seems to me fallacious, and in a straightforward way fallacious. No one imagines that the constitutional prohibition of slavery forced those who believed in slaveholding to practice the religion of those who did not. Would Cuomo have us suppose that laws protecting workers against what he, in line with the solemn teaching of every pope from Leo XIII to Benedict XVI, considers to be the exploitation and abuse of labor, have the effect of forcing non-Catholic factory owners to practice Catholicism? Of course not. At another point, in denying that there was any inconsistency between his willingness as governor to act on his anti-death penalty views, but not on his anti-abortion views, Cuomo denied ever having spoken against the death penalty as a moral issue. He claimed, in fact, and I quote him, that he seldom talks in terms of moral issues, unquote, and that when he speaks of the death penalty, he never suggests that he considers it a moral issue. But then, in the very next sentence, he condemned the death penalty in the most explicitly, indeed one can say flamboyantly, moralistic terms. Let me quote him. "I am against the death penalty because I think it is bad and unfair. It is debasing. It is degenerate. It kills innocent people," unquote. The governor did not pause even to consider that these are precisely the claims made by pro-life citizens against the policy of legal abortion and its public funding, a policy that Cuomo defends in the name of religious liberty. The fact is that Catholics, evangelicals, Mormons, Orthodox Jews, and others who oppose abortion and embryo-destructive research oppose these practices for the same reasons that they oppose postnatal homicides, postnatal taking of human life. Pro-life citizens of various faiths oppose these practices because they involve the deliberate killing of innocent human beings. The ground for supporting the legal prohibition of abortion and embryo-destructive research, presumably Cuomo's own ground, the ground that would make it make any sense for him to be personally opposed to abortion, as opposed to just taking the view that, look, abortion should be legal because there's nothing wrong with it, is the same ground on which we support the legal prohibition of infanticide, for example, even against Singer and Tooley's arguments, or the principle of non-combatant immunity, even in justified wars, or you can't just kill the enemy's prisoners. We subscribe to the proposition that all human beings are equal in worth and dignity and cannot be denied the right to protection against killing on the basis of age or size or stage of development or condition of dependency. That's the principle. That's just it. You're either with it or you're not with it. One cannot then, if I'm right, with moral integrity and logical consistency, be merely personally opposed to abortion or embryo-destructive research while supporting the legal permission of these practices and even their public funding, as so many Catholic politicians do, including most Catholic Democrats and some Catholic Republicans in the United States. For by supporting abortion and embryo-destructive research, they unavoidably implicate themselves in the grave injustice of these practices, if they, in their church, are right that these practices are in fact unjust. Now, of course, it's possible for a person wielding public power to use that power to establish or preserve a legal right to abortion, for example, while at the same time wishing or even hoping that no one will exercise the right. And I'm sure that's sincerely what Governor Cuomo believes. I'm sure Governor Cuomo hopes and wishes that no one would actually have an abortion or perform an abortion. But it seems to me that this doesn't get people like Governor Cuomo off the moral hook or rescue their argument. For someone who acts to protect legal abortion while knowing that it is the taking of innocent human life, and that's, of course, Cuomo, because he's got some reason for being personally opposed to abortion. What's the reason? Well, it has to be because it's the taking of innocent human life. Such a person, whatever he or she hopes, necessarily, unavoidably, wills that abortion's unborn victims be denied the elementary legal protections against deliberate homicide that one favors for oneself and for those whom one considers to be worthy of the law's protection. Thus, one violates the most basic precept of normative social and political theory, which is essentially a variant of the Golden Rule. One divides humanity into two classes, and here's the fundamental problem with the Cuomo logic. You divide humanity into the class of those whom one is willing to admit to the community of the commonly protected and protect by the community's laws, and those in the other class whom one wills to be excluded from it. However much sympathy one has for them and hopes that people won't do bad things to them, one wills their exclusion from the law's protections. They get put into category B. One draws a line, and out the window goes the principle of equality. By exposing members of the disfavored class to lethal violence, one deeply implicates oneself in the injustice of killing them, even if one sincerely hopes, which again I'm sure Governor Cuomo does sincerely hope. I'm not by any means accusing him of being insincere or of being cynical or being in bad faith. I know he sincerely hopes that no one will act on the right to have abortion. But the goodness of what one wishes or hopes for does not redeem the injustice of what one wills if in fact there's an injustice there. To suppose otherwise is to commit yet another fallacy. Well, if my analysis so far is correct, the question arises, what should the leaders of the church do about people like Cuomo and his immediate successor as New York's governor, Republican George Pataki, who took the same position? And again, this is not a partisan thing. There are Republicans and Democrats both making this argument, and Catholics as well as non-Catholics. Again, I'm focused on Catholics for the reasons I indicated at the beginning. But we've got this new question, this interesting question. What should religious leaders do? Should the separation of church and state principle cause them to just stay out of this, to not say anything or not do anything when members of their faith are violating what they regard to be a fundamental principle of justice? What should they do, say Catholic bishops do, about those who claim to be in full communion with the church, yet promote what if the church says is true, are gravely unjust and scandalous policies that expose a class of people to violence and injustice? Well, in the run-up to the 2004 presidential election, seems a long time ago, but you'll remember, I'm sure, even those of you who are in college will probably still remember that in 2004 there was a big controversy when St. Louis Catholic Archbishop Raymond Burke offered an answer to the question, what should the bishops do? He declared that public officials who support abortion and other attacks against innocent human life, euthanasia and so forth, may not be admitted to Holy Communion, the preeminent sacrament of unity according to the Catholic understanding of sacramental theology. Pro-life citizens of every religious persuasion, not just Catholics, applauded the Archbishop's stand. Critics, however, again, Catholic and non-Catholic, were quick to condemn him. They denounced Archbishop Burke for crossing the line, as they put it, separating church and state, interfering as a religious leader in politics. But it seems to me this can't possibly be right. Whatever Archbishop Burke should have done, I don't see how he could possibly be accused of crossing the line separating church and state. In acting on his authority as a bishop to discipline members of his flock who commit what the church teaches are grave injustices against innocent human beings, Archbishop Burke was exercising his own constitutional right to the free exercise of religion. He was not depriving others of their right. Freedom, after all, is a two-way street. People sometimes don't seem to understand it, but it goes both ways. No one is compelled by law to accept anybody's ecclesiastical authority. In the United States, that's it. We do have religious liberty. No one can be compelled to acknowledge the authority of anybody. I cannot be compelled to acknowledge the authority of, let's say, the Quorum of the 12 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A Latter-day Saint can't be compelled to respect the authority of a great rabbi. A Jewish person can't be compelled to accept the authority of Catholic bishops. But Archbishop Burke, just like anybody else in the United States of America or other freedom-respecting nations, has every right to exercise spiritual authority over anyone who chooses to accept it. There's a name for people who do accept the authority of Catholic bishops. They're called Catholics. Now, in many cases, The charge that Archbishop Burke and other bishops who adopt the policy of excluding pro-abortion politicians from communion, or pro-choice politicians, as they prefer to be called, from communion, are crossing the line separating church and state has a bit of the ring of hypocrisy about it. An example of this comes from a prominent newspaper in my own home state of New Jersey called the Bergen Record. Now, Bishop John Smith, who is the Catholic Bishop of Trenton, New Jersey, did not go as far as Raymond Burke in St. Louis had gone in forbidding pro-choice Catholic politicians from receiving communion. Bishop Smith did, however, in the words of the Bergen Record, publicly lash then Governor James McGreevey, who was at the time a Catholic, for his support of abortion and embryo-destructive research. For criticizing the governor on these grounds, the Bergen Record lashed the bishop in an editorial. The editors of the paper accused the bishop of jeopardizing what they called the delicate balance of our constitutional structure, contrasting Bishop Smith's position unfavorably with President John F. Kennedy's assurance to a group of Protestant ministers in Houston in 1960 that he as a Catholic would not govern the nation by appeal to his Catholic religious beliefs. Well, since the Record had seen fit to take us back to 1960 for guidance, I thought I would invite the editors to consider a case that had arisen only a few years before that. In a letter to the editor, I proposed a question that would enable readers to determine immediately whether the editors of the Bergen Record were persons of strict principle or were hypocrites. I reminded readers that in the 1950s, in the midst of the political conflict over segregation, Archbishop Joseph Rummel of New Orleans, the Catholic Archbishop of New Orleans, publicly informed Catholics that support for racial segregation was incompatible with Catholic teaching on the inherent dignity and equal rights of all human beings. Archbishop Rummel said, and let me quote him, that, quote, racial segregation is morally wrong and sinful because it is a denial of the unity and solidarity of the human race as conceived by God in the creation of Adam and Eve, unquote. He warned Catholic public officials that support for segregation placed their souls in peril. He told them they were risking going to hell. Indeed, Rummel took the step of publicly excommunicating Leander Perez, one of the most powerful political bosses in Louisiana, and two other Catholic politicians who promoted legislation designed to impede the desegregation of diocesan schools. So I asked the editors of the Bergen Record, was Archbishop Rummel wrong? Or do Catholics cross the line, Catholic bishops cross the line and jeopardize the delicate constitutional balance or separation of church and state only when their rebukes to politicians contradict the views of the editors of the Bergen Record? To their credit, the editors of the Bergen Record published my letter, but I'm still waiting for them to reply. There was no reply. It was kind of bothering. I wanted a reply. Now, some good and sincere people have expressed concern that Archbishop Burke and bishops of similar mind are guilty of a double standard when it comes to demanding of politicians fidelity to Catholic teaching on justice and the common good. They point out that bishops who would deny communion to those who publicly support abortion and embryo-destructive research do not take the same stand against politicians who support the death penalty, which Pope John Paul II condemned in all but the rarest circumstances, and the U.S. invasions of Iraq, of which the Pope and many other Vatican officials were sharply critical. Now, this is a serious objection. This is by no means trivial. This is a thoughtful objection. The people who make this objection really deserve an answer. Now, the answer begins this way. The Catechism of the Catholic Church indeed teaches that the death penalty should not be used except in circumstances so rare these days as to be, in the words of the late Pope, practically non-existent. However, 2 points must be borne in mind in considering the obligations of Catholics and the question whether Catholic politicians who support the death penalty have in fact broken faith in communion with the Church. First, neither the Pope nor the Catechism places the death penalty on a par with abortion and other forms of direct killing of the innocent. Indeed, the Church will probably never equate the death penalty with these forms of homicide, even if it eventually issues a definitive condemnation of the practice of the death penalty, which frankly I expect it will. Second, the status of the teaching differs from the status of the teaching on abortion. As John Paul II made clear in his encyclical Letter Evangelium Vitae on the Gospel of Life. The teaching on abortion, as well as on euthanasia and all other forms of direct killing of the innocent, is infallibly proposed by the ordinary and universal magisterium of the Church pursuant to the criteria set forth in a document called Lumen Gentium, paragraph 25 of the document Lumen Gentium, which was one of the great documents of the Second Vatican Council, the one that was fundamentally concerned with addressing the question of the authority of the Church. Now, of course, here we're into a purely intra-Catholic discussion. It's about the Church's own conception of its authority and the level of authority at which various types of teaching are pitched. And by infallibly here, I'm not talking about papal infallibility. The Pope's not claiming that he has exercised what Catholics regard as his charism of personal infallibility, as popes have very, very rarely in history. He's talking about a teaching being proposed by the bishops across time, united with the Pope, having considered possible lines of objection, but holding to a common teaching. Now, the same is plainly not true of the developing teaching on the death penalty. Moreover, Cardinal Avery Dulles, the late Cardinal Avery Dulles, and others have interpreted the teaching against the death penalty, as we now find it in the teachings of John Paul II and in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, as essentially a prudential judgment about its advisability, not a moral prohibition following from the application of a strict principle. Now, as it happens, I don't agree with their analysis. I had, before he died, a very intense and wonderful, from my point of view, exchange of messages with Cardinal Dulles, in which he defended the view that the teaching in Evangelium Vitae and in the Catechism was, though important, still merely a prudential teaching about the advisability of the death penalty in our circumstances. It seemed to me from the language presented in both the encyclical and the Catechism that can't be right, that the Pope is in fact proposing this teaching as a strict moral norm. So I don't agree with Dulles' position on that, and the position of many other conservative Catholics who think that the death penalty teaching is just prudential. But I do think that given the dispute between, at the highest theological levels, between people who read the document one way and those who read it the other way, no one will be able to say with confidence from a Catholic point of view which side in this debate is right until the magisterium itself clarifies the teaching. So it cannot be said that supporters of the death penalty are obstinately persisting in manifest grave sin, which is the standard set forth in the Code of Canon Law, in paragraph 915 of the Code of Canon Law, for the denial of communion to persons who present themselves for communion but may cause scandal because of their public acts. Now, no one can legitimately claim then that opposition to the death penalty has the definitively settled status that the teachings on abortion and euthanasia do, nor can one claim that the Church teaches or will ever teach the death penalty except in cases where it is applied unjustly, of course, involves the grave intrinsic injustice attaching to any act involving the direct killing of the innocent. Obviously, if someone is put to death on a racial motive or another bad motive, then you've got an intrinsic injustice. Now, regarding the question of the U.S. invasions of Iraq, it's important to understand the precise terms of Catholic teaching on just and unjust warfare. These terms are set forth with clarity and precision in the Catechism. In line with the Church's historic teaching on the subject, neither Pope John Paul II nor Pope Benedict XVI has asserted that opposition to the war is binding on the consciences of Catholics. John Paul II's statements opposing the use of force in the run-up to both invasions plainly questioned the prudential judgments of political leaders who, in the end, had and have the right and responsibility, according to the Catechism and the entire tradition of Catholic teaching on war and peace, to make judgments as to whether force is in fact necessary. There's no doubt the Pope was against those wars. He made very clear that he was against those wars. He pleaded with both Presidents Bush not to go into those wars. But the teaching that he proposed, his position, was offered as a prudential teaching, basically concerned with the proportionality of the force that would have to be used. That's why the Pope and bishops have not said, and will not say, that Catholic soldiers may not participate in the war. This contrasts with their clear teaching that Catholics may not participate in abortions or other forms of embryo killing, or support the use of taxpayer monies for activities involving the deliberate killing of innocent human beings. Let me close with a word about this question of the separation of church and state. In scolding the bishops, the editors of the Bergen Record were joined by the editors of the New York Times, who also published an editorial back in 2004, insisting that separation of church and state means that no religious leader may presume to tell public officials what their positions may and may not be on matters of public policy. But if we shift the focus from abortion to, say, genocide or slavery or the exploitation of labor or racial segregation, we see that such a view is actually quite implausible. When Archbishop Rummel excommunicated the segregationist politicians in the 1950s, what did the New York Times say? I was curious, so I went back and looked. Far from condemning Archbishop Rummel for intruding in politics and crossing the line separating church and state, the editors of the New York Times praised him for a prophetic act of witness against racial injustice. So in my view, the New York Times was right then, they're wrong now. Thank you very, very much.
We do have time for a few questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Here you go, Kim.
Hello. It's awkward to stand because of where I am, but I will. I'm Kimberly Caldwell.
Tell me who you are and if you're a student here.
I'm a student here. Nice to meet you. So the question
But you haven't told me who you are.
The microphone goes in and out. I'm Kimberly Caldwell.
Kimberly, nice to meet you.
So one of the things that I wished you would have addressed that you didn't is the story behind why this outline, why present this argument through the Cuomo speech, why, I mean, clearly something has happened that made this relevant to you and made it the outline through which you discussed it. So I hope you could give us some background on how you came to this outline for making this argument.
What seemed to me to be fitting because of it's the 25th anniversary and the issue has not gone away. It's the same issue year in and year out every time we have an election. This time, not only did we have the question of an election, even after the election and the president was elected, we had the issue because of President Obama's honorary degree and graduation speech at Notre Dame. So time and time again, we have the question, what is the proper role of churches and religious leaders? What is the proper role of faith, their faith, as it bears on moral issues, for political leaders who identify with traditions that have teachings that they're then contradicting in their public activities? So given that we have an anniversary to celebrate and the issue has not gone away, it seemed to me a very appropriate issue to raise, especially with students of public service, because I suspect that many of the students here are themselves religious believers, people of faith, and they're going to be heading off into careers where sometimes they're going to have to ask themselves, what are my political obligations and how do they relate to my moral obligations, which in turn reflect in some way, no doubt, my religious convictions? How does that all fit together? We as citizens, even those of us who are not in political offices, face that as well. We have to decide how should we, on what basis should we cast our vote? What issues should count for us? How should we prioritize issues? But I think the problem is especially dramatic for people who are going into public service. So I hope that my remarks this evening will be of some use to those of you who are students in thinking about that. And I hope that you'll go back and look at what Cuomo says and think about how he might respond to me and consider what I said in light of what he said and see where you think the truth lies.
Yes, sir. Hold on.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Steve.
Are you a student, Steve?
I'm not a student
Okay.
here. I wanted you to tell me about the kind of common good that legislators are obligated to embed within the legal system. And the reason, I guess, is that I was curious about what you said about Cuomo's position on consensus morality. I thought you kind of shortchanged him. And the reason I thought you shortchanged him was that you were so exercised to show that human dignity is a concept that is shared across faith traditions and by people who don't believe in God. And so it struck me that you wanted to point out that human dignity is a part of our public morality rather than being something tied to Catholic dogma. So in your discussion of the obligations of the legislature, that was what you were up to. That's how the argument worked. If it's not consensus morality that we're supposed to embed within the laws, it can't be Catholic belief straightforwardly that we're supposed to embed within the laws. So I just want you to say more about the kinds of moral obligations that a legislator might have in a pluralistic community.
Okay. First, I think I have to disappoint you because I did give the idea that our politics should be based on consensus morality short shrift because I don't think it deserves long shrift. I think the idea is so obviously wrong that just thinking about it for a minute will cause us or should cause us to reject it. Here's why. In circumstances of political liberty, as the great Harvard philosopher John Rawls taught, I made something of a career of being a critic of Professor Rawls, but I agree with him on this. In circumstances of political freedom, and especially religious freedom, we can expect that there will be some significant diversity of views, even on fundamental moral questions. But we simply could not get along. It wouldn't work. Society couldn't be maintained if we decided that the only laws that we would have are laws that enjoy a consensus, where there are very, very few dissenters. Because what that would mean is you would have grave, what many, many, many citizens regard as grave injustices that would go unaddressed. Everything from slavery to the exploitation of labor. You know, whatever issue you think about, we can identify a time and a place when, in circumstances of political freedom, you're going to not have consensus on that issue. But still, for the sake of justice, those who believe as they believe will feel compelled, rightly feel compelled, to redress what they regard as an injustice. So it was no argument against Wilberforce that there was no consensus on slavery. There was no argument, there was no, it didn't count as an argument against those who struggled against the exploitation of labor in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, that there were different philosophies out there. There were some laissez-faire social Darwinists who said, look, you know, exploitation is in the eye of the beholder. Let the devil take the hindmost. And those who had a different view and said, no, you know, we need laws to protect people against abuse by employers. The fact of pluralism means that we will not be able simply to rely on consensus. But come back at me. Go ahead.
Hold on, Steve. Hold on. Yeah.
Speak in a deep voice.
Yeah.
Isn't that precisely what Rawls means when he talks about overlapping consensus? Is that in fact, that overlapping consensus doesn't mean unanimous agreement, but it means that in fact, groups of very divergent metaphysical commitments will still agree on some basic truths, right? That human dignity is to be ascribed to all persons, what have you, right?
Yeah. Of course, the missing step in there is Rawls' conception of public reason, right? And there is where I think Rawls goes wrong. He draws the boundaries of public reason so narrowly that only that which fits into what happens to be the contemporary political ideology of liberalism counts as a public reason. It seems to me that he's right to insist that in our political activities and discourse, at least when it comes to what he calls fundamental questions of justice, that our activities should be based on public reasons that we can give in exchange with each other and not mere private knowledge or revelation or anything like that. But the fact that there are people who disagree with them, or even widespread disagreement with them, doesn't negate their force for anybody who recognizes them as a reason. So he has to struggle mightily to save Martin Luther King. Do you remember this section of political liberalism? It seems to me the most implausible part of the whole book. You know, there was not a consensus over race. There just wasn't. There were people, including some very, very badly misguided people of goodwill, who were just on the wrong side of that. And it should not have shut Martin Luther King down because there were people who disagreed about the morality of the thing.
We have time for one more.
I'm Dewi. I'm from Indonesia. I'm a student here at Clinton School. Thank you for being here, Professor George. I have a question. Do you have any comparison between politicians that are really religious in this regard, like Christian or Catholic or any religious in the United States, and compare with politicians that have no like religious background in taking policies in servicing public? Do you have any comparison how effective they addressing some issues, like for instance abortion or war or any crucial issues that engaging more than one race or more than religion, across religion, across race, or across tribes? Do you have any comparison? I just wonder. Thank you.
Well, it's a very interesting question, but the United States is the wrong place to test it. And that's because not only are we a much more religious nation than, in other words, the levels of religious belief and practice, daily prayer, Bible, you name it, are so much higher than Europe and Australia and even Canada, that it turns out that we don't have very many politicians who at least profess to be unbelievers. If you look in the Congress, I think there's one or two people who categorize themselves as not religious or secular or unbelievers or atheists. Just about everybody else, I don't know if they're telling the truth, but just about everybody else it'd be bad politics, I think, to not identify with some religion. Will put down a religious affiliation. We do know some things from the polling data, and I don't do this kind of political science, but I have friends back in my department at Princeton who do, and I'll bet you have a few in the political science and sociology departments down here. My friends in political science tell me that religious practice is very salient as a predictor of political views and voting behavior across the United States. And this is interesting because it means what the political scientists call the cleavages, the divisions, are not what you might have expected them to be if you knew something more about, if you know a lot about the history of the United States. That is, we don't divide between religions, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. The division cuts across the religions. So if you have more traditional Catholic beliefs, or you attend Mass frequently, you're much more likely to be voting the same way as an evangelical Protestant who regularly attends religious services and has traditional views, and an Orthodox Jew who, of course, regularly attends his synagogue and has daily practice of his religion and so forth. And you will be voting in a way very different from your co-religionists who have less of a high degree of religious observance and less traditional religious beliefs and practices, who in turn will be voting much more like a member of a more liberal Protestant denomination or a Reformed Jewish community. So religion matters for voting. We know that, but it doesn't matter in the sense that your religion will dictate how you vote. Your religious affiliation will be a predictor of how you vote. It's your degree of tradition, traditional belief, and the extent of your practice that's the real predictor. And I suspect, and it's just a guess now, I mean, I've never talked to my colleagues about this one, but I'll bet if we just looked at the legislators themselves, we would get probably something like that. Probably not quite as dramatic, but we'd get something that would be along the same trajectory, that those legislators who are more observant are going to be more conservative on social issues, those who are less, probably more liberal on social issues.